and welcome to Varn Blog Solo. There's a paradox at the heart of so much of contemporary politics: the politics of statements, the politics of posting, the politics of commentary, the politics of a constantly churning commentariat, which confuses the commentary and positions one has on any number of geopolitical things with actually doing something about them. I tend to not like to talk about active conflicts because one, the fog of war is thick and people are easily fooled but based off of all kinds of misinformation. Two, there are less journalists on the ground anywhere who aren't also tied to some governments to get access, so it's very hard to get good information that is not incredibly biased. And three, a lot of these statements change hearts and minds in places that don't have any effect on the conflict. And there's reality of the situation that needs to be looked at here. When it comes to when the US government gives millions of dollars to a war, public opposition to that is not very relevant unless you're willing to completely buck trends and vote people out of office on principle grounds, which is hard to do because the structure of the US um, election system being highly federalized and uh, election law being constitutionally state by state idiosyncratic, with some protections and guaranteed by the Constitution, but not that many. It's very hard at this moment to actually have an effect on foreign policy. Foreign policy is in the least democratically responsive forms of government, usually in the administrative state as understood through the executive. And given that Congress is perpetually stalled out, no matter who's in charge of it, but particularly when there's a divided Congress these days, and there's a thousand reasons for this. Lack of pork spending, the increasing focus on national politics of where your vote actually matters less, the increased need for larger and larger amounts of money to maintain a media campaign, etc. It means that foreign policy is the area where you have the least effect. So constantly churning foreign policy discussions as if your post or actions or protest even have an effect has become narcissistic. But what makes it worse, whether we're talking about the Israel Palestine war, the Ukraine Russia war, is that there is a tendency to see, because of the lack of ability to do much on domestic politics, stances on foreign politics as being more crucial than they even can be. I used to bemoan the lack of interest in international politics on the left, not because I wanted people to take facile stances on it, but because I wanted people to start developing a sense of what they would do in their own country. But there's something particularly ghoulish about people using war commentary to get views and clicks and adding very little analysis to the debate. There's more commentary than journalism. Right now, we need people who have knowledge of what's going on the ground and can get it to you with a relatively unbiased situation in a variety of contexts, and we don't get those things. Furthermore, most leftists are more interested in posting and making moral stances about these conflicts than doing much about them. There have been exceptions. Hassan Piker raising aid for Palestinian humanitarian aid is actually doing something, although it is within the purview of liberal charity. But liberal charity in this scenario is about the most you can actually actively do that may have some effect. You can write your congressperson, it's unlikely to have an effect. If you understand the way the money works in this country, it becomes very clear that weakening the military actually weakens the dollar. Hence why you're in a paradox. Yes, we are blowing tons of debt to other countries' wars at this point in the United States, as is Europe. We are curtailing speech. We're actively supporting apartheid. Not the first time either. And I guess you could call for things like BDS, etc., although it's hard to see, if we are honest, what effect that will have in a country like Israel, whose major exports of technology in the arms industry, things that governments tend to be a little bit more unwilling to give up access to. On Russia, on Israel, on what's going on in Rojava with Turkey, on what went on in Armenia and Azerbaijan. In fact, so much is going on that it's hard for people to keep up because every bit of focus on one international conflict leaves other zones vulnerable to lack of attention. And all this is happening while the UAW is ramping up striking and what is turning out to be the largest number of strikes in, well, the largest number of people on strikes in US history. Now, as a percentage of the workforce, it's still low, and don't let people fool you on that. But it's a big change, but it has to be discussed in the lack of unionization too. For example, the UAW has a lot of downstream effect on non-unionized workers who are turning against the UAW. Leftists don't talk about that, and the answer is not, of course, to blame the UAW's workers, but to talk about the lack of unionization in general. The way franchise auto technicians and auto sailors have made this cost often passed on to different parts of the supply chain, not just the quote consumer unquote, but also other workers, thus pitting workers against each other. This is very real, and this has to be addressed, and it isn't. So this is the paradox of speech as politics. You have a limited amount of attention. You have a limited amount of effect. When you speak, you should speak carefully, particularly if you're engaging in left media apparatuses or some kind of sectarian grouping. I'm not here to tell people what their stances should be. I'm also not here to just both sides everything and say, oh, it's complicated. It is complicated, but that's neither here nor there. The reality of the situation here is that a lot of us are speaking to bring attention to ourselves, to use a conflict to get attention onto ourselves. And in a way that we won't have much effect. Now, you can grandstand and make moral declarations till you get blacklisted. Fine. I suppose that's a kind of bravery, but it won't actually change much, except make your life harder. The reality of the situation on the ground in all of these places is in some ways horrible. And quote the West, by that we mean NATO, the US, and Europe, and don't ever count Europe out of agency here. Don't see them as not agents. This is something I get tired of. They're not just a US proxy state. We have to keep an eye on 1,000 balls at once, and yet we tend to focus on the ones where we can make the most noise about, have the most division, and do the least. It is important to talk about what is happening in Israel and Palestine. It is not important to grandstand about it. It is important to talk about what is happening in Russia and Ukraine. It is not important to grandstand about it. Most of us have no effect on this policy whatsoever. Understanding it will mean the ability to take care of things in our own countries. But I can tell you that posting and public opinion has less and less effect in most of these states. The veil of democracy is a veil. We have long since shifted over to oligarchy in the in the classical sense almost. You have to realize that and accept that to be able to affect change. So the paradox of speech is we need free speech. And we can see all the suppression of speech about Palestine in Europe as why it is important. And yet we also aren't going to change policy just by speaking or even protesting. You actually have to start affecting the means of how power is operated, or it's a waste of time. And that's a paradox because in one sense we do need people to know what's going on. And there's no way to be neutral about these situations. Like you can present information as objectively as possible and I would tell you to try. But complete neutrality is impossible. And yet, confusing that speech, confusing consciousness raising, confusing the focus and the blur is a way to build media careers and little else. And it's ghoulish to build media careers off of these kinds of wars. Discussion of political economy in these scenarios tends to be thin. The political economy of Middle East does not actually resemble that of Latin America or even most of Africa. The role of small business remittances to the region is actually super important, as is the extracted capacity of the Gulf states and its military strategic relationship between several continents. It doesn't have large productive capacities in an industrial area the way we think about it. And so talking about it in those terms as an answer to national liberation or whatever doesn't really help you. That is maybe more applicable in the Ukraine Russia situation where things are also fairly complicated, but it is not going to help you here. So, questions that come up baffle me. Did Hamas end the culture war? What does that even fucking mean? The question is almost a category error. The culture war isn't one thing, nor can an event perpetuated by an Islamist natural liberationist group really end it. It'll just shift things around. What are you referring to? You're playing with words there. Clearly to get people interested. Nor is hanging on every bit of news going to change much. We aren't going to know a lot about these conflicts for years, even though we're flooded with information about them. The claims and counterclaims are going to be astronomical in their hyperbole. If you want to do something about this and not end up in a RICO case, you're going to have to decide where to put your money. And where to start building small power bases to actually change the electoral system instead of long Hail Mary passes at national candidates who can't and probably wouldn't be allowed to win anyway, nor can you project false hope upon your immediate demographics upon the entire country. Yet when you think that your stances matter this much, it's easy to get confused and to project and to miss the point. So the paradox of speech here is that we need it, and yet it also can become a pseudo activity at the same time. I would say this, putting pressure on your governmental officials might be something that you could do. But what that pressure is probably won't look like a rally. Rallies are for us. They're for us to build solidarity, to understand each other, to build relations. They rarely ever actually lead to change. As I've said 1,000 times, the anti war protests may have some effect on the way the Vietnam War ran down, but the Viet Cong had the bigger one. And that's something people need to live with. Like and subscribe. I don't care if you join the Patreon. I don't want to be ghoulish off of this stuff.